that's all right. So welcome to this Observatory webinar. I'm Charles Lane, I'm in York, and I'm with my colleagues Chris Malumphy. And who have we got on the line from Forest Research?
From Forest Research, we have Lucy, Susie, and Anna.
Welcome everybody. Welcome to everybody who's dialed in, and for all of those who might listen to it after the event. So we're going to start off. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the wilt diseases. So I'm going to talk about some basic tree physiology, and then talk about wilts, and then we can have just a general question and answer session at the end. Feel free to ask questions during the webinar. I know sometimes that can be quite difficult for people to know when to ask a question. But because the slides will run so slowly, there'll be plenty of pauses, I think. So if you want to ask a question, just shout up, just get involved, okay, if that's all right. So I thought to just start off thinking about why do trees wilt, and in trying to understand that, it's really perhaps going back to the very first basics, I think, really, about some tree physiology. So I was trying to think about this and actually thinking that at the end of the day, if a tree wants to produce energy, it has to photosynthesize using obviously sunlight and chlorophyll as a catalyst, but it needs water and it needs carbon dioxide. Obviously the great difficulty is the leaves are high up in the air and the water is right down in the ground. So how does the actual tree transport water from the roots up to the leaves? So that occurs in vessels, and these are specialized cells, and they are contained in something called xylem. And the xylem, you'll find the cells which are alive are in the sapwood because they're transporting sap. And when the cells die, they then become part of the heartwood, and they're the structural component. So it's really the xylem which is responsible for transporting water from the roots right up to the top of the tree. The mechanism is quite difficult. It's not like a human body where there's a pump pumping water up to the leaves, and there's no pumping mechanism. So how does the water get from the roots right up to the top of the leaves? And some of those trees, you know, could be 50, 60, 70, 80 meters tall. So it's a very difficult process without any kind of physical pump. That happens by a process of evaporation. So water evaporates from the surface of the leaves, and in doing so, water is drawn up through the conducting vessels or the xylem. And you get this huge column of water which is pulled up from the leaves all the way up from the roots. So it's really that process of drawing water up through evaporation. One of the things which is also quite helpful to understand is actually how those vessels are connected. So if you imagine a whole series of drinking straws, one stood on top of another, they're all the little individual cells that make up those connections from roots right up to leaves. And within that, there are those tube-like structures may be connected seamlessly, so they actually are open at the ends, and the way that they are open forms these tube-like structures. So if you were to cut a tree in half and look across the trunk of the tree, you'll see rings of the tree. They're the annual growth rings. And some trees have the ability that when they grow at the start of the season, in the early or spring wood, when it's first laid down, it produces lots of quite large vessels. And this helps with quick water transport. So some trees have that ability to do that. And they're called ring porous. Well, other trees don't do that. They produce the same size vessels regardless of whether it's summer or spring. They're much smaller vessels, and they're described as being diffuse porous. And that affects the way that many of these trees will be susceptible to different types of pest and disease damage. The other important thing to remember, obviously, is as the tree is round, the vascular tissue, this xylem and phloem, goes all the way round the tree. So if you get damage or a blockage to one part of the vascular tissue, often you'll see symptoms of wilting or dieback on only parts of the tree. So again, that's quite a useful thing to think about. So we come back to the original question that I started with, why do trees wilt? So it comes back to the fact that the demand from the leaves is outstripping the supply from the roots. And that's why they lose their turgor pressure and the leaves begin to wilt and droop. So it is a lack of water being provided to the leaves. So it's really thinking about how there's different sort of things that might cause a lack of water supply. Most commonly that will be due to drought. There's insufficient water around the roots and in the soil in order to supply the leaves. If there's not enough water in the leaves, then they'll start to wilt and droop. The other thing, as we talked about, it's so important to understand the physiology of the trees and the way that the vessels and the water conducting tissues are connected. And if they are actually damaged, whether that's physical damage by, say, a vehicle damaging the bark and the sapwood of the tree, or it could be a deer or a rabbit chewing through the sapwood, that again will break that column of water up to the leaves and leads to wilting. And then finally, where we tend to get most involved is looking about different types of pests and diseases. And they may actually cause a variety of different effects. If those pests or diseases actually get into the vascular tissue, the physical presence of those organisms in the tissue will block water supply. But also the host recognises it's under attack. And what it does, it responds to that attack by producing a number of different things that might actually block the vascular tissue. That might be some outgrowths, or like little balloons that block the vessels called tyloses, or frequently they'll produce gums and resins and waxes, and again that will block the vascular tissue. So it's all about water supply. That's why plants wilt, and it's really what might cause that disruption to reduce the amount of supply based on what the leaves need. So if we now go and look at the slides, I'm going to talk sapstreak disease in maples, Ceratocystis fluorescens. We're particularly concerned at the moment in the UK about Ceratocystis platani, as it's present in continental Europe. It's causing a huge amount of damage in the Midi region of France. And there's a really good fact sheet that Forest Research have just produced about plain wilt. But we're perhaps maybe more familiar with the damage and the destruction that something like Dutch elm disease has caused. And that's caused by ophiostoma, which is very closely related to the Ceratocystis fungal diseases. But there are other different types of organisms that can cause vascular wilts. Verticillium, Fusarium are both fungal pathogens, and again very common on certain tree species. Xylella is a bacterial disease, and this is causing real problems in Europe at the moment. But there's also some other microorganisms like phytoplasms which can cause vascular wilts, and also nematodes as well that will all cause problems in the vascular tissue. So plants have very limited ways of expressing themselves. There's only certain things they can do to show they're not feeling well, and one of the things they will do with wilt. So if you do see a wilting tree, it may be due to a pest or a pathogen, but it may be due to a problem like drought and a shortage of water, or it may actually be due to physical damage. So if we could just go on to the next slide, if that's possible, which is slowly coming up in front of you. This is showing the symptoms of oak wilt on leaves, and these are pictures that came from North America, where Ceratocystis fugaciarum is a significant problem. And as you can see, when there's a shortage of water, the leaf responds either by yellowing, which we call chlorosis, or browning, which we call necrosis. And you can see sometimes that discoloration of the leaves affects the whole leaf, dying back to the base. Sometimes it just affects the margin of the leaf, as you can see in A, and then sometimes, like in C, it actually just causes the veins of the leaf to go yellow or brown. So there are quite a different number of ways that vascular wilts can impact upon the leaves. So if we just go on to the next slide, please. Exciting watching these pictures being revealed inch by inch. So these are symptoms of wilted trees in North America, and you can see the amount of damage it can cause. So in the top right hand corner you can see quite an advanced case where actually the crown is looking very thin and is being very heavily defoliated. in the top left-hand corner, you can see very interesting how the leaves have gone yellow and brown, showing that they're dying, but it's not affecting all of the tree. Only a part of the tree has been damaged, which again refers back to the way that the vascular tissue goes all the way around the tree. So in that particular tree, the disease has damaged only part of the vascular tissue. And then the very bottom picture is showing a branch of an oak tree which has got wilted leaves that are starting to turn yellow and eventually brown. So that's the range of symptoms. What you'd probably be looking for first would be wilted leaves on the ends of the foliage, causing dieback and thinning of the crown. So if we move on to the next slide. One of the things that you have to be very careful of with wilted stems and leaves is, again, is this due to a drought problem? We ran a training course down at Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and we were looking at oak trees with some really significant wilting of the terminal shoots, which we all got very frightened about, until someone actually pointed out the very obvious, that the branches which were in full sunlight at 32 degrees centigrade were all wilted, and those branches which were shaded and were not in such extreme temperature weren't wilting. So again, wilting can be just a simple matter of lack of water availability, and particularly common on very hot, dry days. But one of the things you may see with wilt pathogens, and not specific to oak wilt, but generally to quite a lot of wilt pathogens, is damage to the vascular tissue, as characterised by this brown discoloration, and you may be able to see there's a ring of brown in that vascular tissue. And that's a very characteristic thing. You'll very much see that in Dutch elm disease. It's a very good diagnostic feature. So if you do see a wilted stem and you're able just to pull the branch down and cut through it, look to see whether you can see any vascular staining and browning in the tissue, because that's a very good symptom of a fungal wilt. So we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you. So you have two pictures now of the oak bark. So when the pathogen is living in the vascular tissue and the tree starts to die, the organism realizes that it needs to move on and go and find another host to actually try and kill. And the way it does this is to migrate out of the vascular tissue and grow out towards the bark. And in doing so, it pushes the bark out and lifts the bark off, and that's a large amount of fungal mycelium growing underneath the bark. And this has quite a strong fruity odour, and this will often encourage insects into that strong fruity odour that will then feed on the damaged tissue. And in doing so, by lifting the bark and cracking the bark and drawing insects in, those insects will then become infested with fungal spores, and when they then move on to another tree, that is one of the common ways that these pathogens will move around on insect vectors, and is a particular issue for Dutch elm disease. So if we could move on to the next slide. So the concern to us in this particular presentation is about oak wilt, Cerasta cystis fugaciarum, and this is interesting to see the difference in susceptibility between the red oaks and the white oaks. So the red oaks are predominantly of North American, and they are the most susceptible. When you get infection by Cerasta cystis fugaciarum, it will cause a very rapid death indeed. And if you look at leaf B, you can see the amount of damage it causes to the leaf. Unfortunately, you don't see quite so much staining in the vascular tissue, but it is a very rapid death of the trees, and this is what's causing most of the damage in North America at the moment, is in red oaks. In this country, we predominantly have white oaks, and we're very grateful that these are less susceptible. You get a much slower death, which may take several years for it to die, and it's a much more slow death and a slow wilt. And as you can see in A, the amount of damage to the leaves is less dramatic, but you do see a lot more staining in the vascular tissue. One of the reasons for this is because the physiology of the white and red oak is quite different. So in the Red oak, this is described as being ring porous. So this is where you get the formation of the large vessels at the start of spring in that early sapwood, and they are much more vulnerable to the movement of the pathogen up and down the tissue, where the white oak is not like that. It describes as being diffusely porous, and therefore it has smaller vessels, and therefore the fungus finds it harder to move up and down the tissue. So understanding the basic physiology of the tree will give you an indication of how susceptible and how damaging they might be. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So oak wilt was introduced into North America and has now become, unfortunately, relatively prevalent, particularly on the eastern coasts, on the eastern seaboard, where there is a lot of red oak, which again suggests why there has been so much damage. And oak wilt is a major problem in North America, adversely affecting the health of trees and the aesthetic value of those trees as shade trees in that country. So it has been very damaging indeed. If we move on to the next slide. So this is just a simple life cycle just to explain how the pathogen moves around. So it's most likely to be introduced into an uninfested area. So if it was to move from North America into Europe, that is mostly likely to occur on infected planting material or infected wood. But once it's been introduced, it's then likely to spread either by root-to-root contact, because a lot of these trees, the roots graft together, and in that grafting process you'll get transfer of the fungus from one root to another root, so you'll get that very close localized spread, which you can see in the picture on the top right hand corner, how it is spreading within a particular area. But also you may also get beetle infestations, which are drawn into that sweet smelling mycelial mat breaking through the bark. And those oak beetles, in feeding from those areas, will pick up spores and then move on to the next tree and then infect the tree that way. And that's quite a common problem with many of these vascular diseases in how they move. So that was just quite a long summary, I'm afraid, about how trees might wilt, and particularly talk about oak wilt. Of concern to observatory is the plain wilt, which is a particular high priority to us at the moment. So are there any questions?
Sorry, plain wilt, is it the same sort of symptoms that you'd be looking for? Does it stain the vascular tissue in the same way as the...
Anna, would you like to comment?
Yes, on plain, the symptoms that you will see will be very similar. You will see probably wilting of individual branches, or the whole canopy will be wilting, and you will see the staining under the bark. You will find the staining, this kind of discoloration under the bark, the streaking, you will find it.
Okay. And do we know anything about the distribution of it in plain trees? Yes or not?
It's not present in the UK.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, but it is in France. That's why we are thinking that it is likely that if it is quite close to us, it may come. And we are already doing surveys, especially in London, on plane trees. But so far, we have not confirmed the presence of this pathogen in the UK.
We have intercepted it on imported material from Europe, young plant material. So that has been risked. But no, it doesn't occur in the UK, and we're doing everything we can to keep it out, because we've seen the amount of damage it's caused in Europe.
How are they trying to control it in Europe at the moment?
Anna, do you want to comment? I could comment if you can't.
I mean, I know some of the things they are doing. Obviously, I know in France they are cutting the trees down. The problem with this fungus is the sodas. It can spread with the sodas of the trees, and it can spread by root contact as well. Then therefore, when I think the removing the trees, the infected trees, and as I said, it can, because the disease can spread by root contact as well, and as I said, the sawdust, it carries the fungus as well. Then when they are doing all, if you think about plane trees, normally they are severely pruned, and when they are doing all the work, cutting the branches, if they don't clean all the tools they are using, there is a very high risk of infection. Then I don't know if you want to add something else, Charles?
Yeah, so from my understanding, it's got into the canal region of the Midi region in France, and it's basically munching its way through the plane trees, which are part of that World UNESCO Heritage Site, and they believe some of it is by root-to-root contact and grafting. A lot of it, they think, is because people who are in boats on holiday are not very experienced of driving these boats, and they're ramming into trees, picking up the fungus, and then ramming into another tree further up the canal and spreading it that way through a wound. And effectively, they're having to cut down and remove the portion of those trees. So it's a pretty bad situation for France.
So in the UK, the risk is predominantly urban areas. I mean, London, obviously.
Yeah, yes, I would think so. I think obviously the London plane tree would be susceptible, and that is where you're going to see that huge aesthetic damage. And it's most likely to come into this country on infected planting material or possibly infected wood. So there are measures to prevent that from happening. And then once it arrives, it would then spread by root-to-root contact and possibly by insect transmission as well at a local level.
It only affects, well, we only know it only affects oak. It doesn't spread to other species.
So Serrata cystis fagacearum, which is the oak wilt, is predominantly a pathogen of oak, but it can affect some other broadleaf tree species. As far as I'm aware, Serrata cystis platani, which is the plain wilt, is specific to plain. Is that right, Anna?
Yeah. Sorry, okay. I don't know if you could hear me. I said yes.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
Sorry.
Could I ask a fairly simple question from an entomologist, not a pathologist? Some of these wilts cause necrosis, and it just makes the leaves turn brown. Of course, at this time of the year, the leaves are turning brown because it's autumn. Is there any way of separating the necrosis due to a wilt and from just the seasonal autumnal effects?
Good question, Chris. So I think the best time to be looking for wilts tends to be in the spring and summer. But certainly what I would be looking for is the brown staining in the stems, and that tends to be indicative of a fungal infection which is causing the wilting.
Yes, I agree. I mean, the way in the autumn, how they break the color, and they turn brown, it can be confused with some of these with the symptoms caused by these vascular pathogens, because they turn brown, but sometimes they turn brown, but they have like even a yellow margin, like a yellow halo, and that can be confused, for example, with what Charles mentioned earlier on, Xylella, that is another pathogen caused by bacterium, and it can be confused. The symptoms can be confusing as well. I think the best time to look, as Charles said, for vascular diseases obviously is spring and summer. In the autumn it can be confusing.
So I think in summary, if you see a wilting plant, I would always first of all try and rule out that it's not some kind of drought or water supply problem. If you can rule that out, then I would start looking for physical damage to the base of the tree to see again whether that has been disrupted the water uptake, then start thinking about whether it might be a pest or disease problem. And it may be one of those things that you want to go and look at once, and if it's a hot, dry day, you may want to go back on a cooler, wetter day and see whether the symptoms are still showing in the same part of the plant. But again, it tends to be drought first, physical damage, and then only pest and disease is the last thought in your mind. But certainly looking for the vascular staining is a very good thing to do to help confirm it might be a pest or disease problem.
I have to say, for example, this year we had quite a few inquiries about sycamore trees. They were showing wilting of individual branches, and it was a squirrel damage, for example, and people got very worried because of some of these new pathogens. And but luckily, in a way, it was only squirrels. Then it's always, as Charles says, have a look to the affected branches just to make sure that they haven't been damaged.
Yeah, so again, always look for the obvious cause first, I think, which is not normally pest or disease. Does anybody have any more questions about the presentation, or just general questions that we can help you with?
Well, it's still on the wilt side of things,
Okay.
but in a practical sense, though, if you see a wilted branch 20 feet up in a tree, you can't really go looking for vascular staining. So what does one do in that situation? If you've gone back on a cool, wet day and it's still wilting, do you just report it to fire tree alert and let somebody else deal with it, or what?
Okay, if you see a London plane or a plane tree wilting, if you report it through tree alert, we send the tree health officers to see the tree. At the moment, any reports we have on plane trees, we are going and visit, and we go with the specialists and tree specialists who will climb the tree and take samples for us. If you see any plane trees showing wilting of branches, yes, please, if you could report it through tree alert, and we'll send the tree health officers to have a look and collect the samples.
Okay, and oaks, we're not really, well, we're hoping it's not going to appear here, so but if we see wilted oak branches, then presumably the same applies.
Yes, as I said, we hope it's not going to be here, but obviously we never know. But if you see the symptoms, obviously the best thing is to report it.
Okay, yep, thank you.
Any more questions?
I don't think so, not from me.
Thanks very much, that's very helpful. Does anybody else have any more comments or questions?
No, thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you everybody. Thanks for your time again, and we look forward to hearing you at the next webinar. Thanks very much everybody. Bye.